Hi there, welcome to the eCommerce Nurse podcast, our 32nd episode. I'm Karina McLeod, ex-Amazonian and CEO and founder of eCommerce Nurse and Vendor Society. Today, we're going to be talking about using data integration to grow and scale your e-commerce business. We have a special guest, Robin H. Smith, who has over 28 years of experience in supply chain and data integration. Robin is the co-founder and CEO of OMNI, an iPaaS managed service platform that is both elastic and scalable to the demands of scaling e-commerce and multi-channel merchants. So hi, Robin, a big thank you for taking the time to come on the show today. I'm super excited to talk to you about this subject of one that I am actually not so knowledgeable about.
Well, thanks for having me. It's excellent to be here and happy to explore this the kind of esoteric subject that's basically plumbing. So.
Exactly. So that gives us a great intro in terms of where to start, and it would be great. And I know we spoke about this just before I hit the record button. Is let's first talk about the basics in terms of what iPaaS is and what we mean when we start talking about data integration when we relate it to e-commerce.
So let's start with what integration is. Integration gets bandied about as you know, as a sort of a catch-all term for connectivity to payment gateways in e-com, loyalty, and so on and so forth. But at its foundation, it's really the connectivity between applications. So it's the application to application movement of the data. Traditionally, this was the domain of the IT shop, and everything was custom coded. In the old days, you moved data by flat file with secure FTP or other mechanisms. Sometimes files were emailed. Integration has evolved and become a lot more complex. As we've moved to cloud-based applications, we have APIs, programming interfaces, where you actually can now interact in real time with the application. And as a business scales and as transactional volumes increase, the cost of doing manual data entry and the errors that are introduced start to justify integration and the costs of it. So typically we see three different approaches. We see small to medium-sized businesses who are very cost sensitive. They'll go out, they'll find a custom programmer off of one of the freelance boards, or they'll go to Southeast Asia and they'll find somebody super cheap to build them an integration between their ERP and Amazon or their Shopify store, big commerce store. Others will rely on their own internal IT resources to do that. And those approaches are both valid in certain circumstances. I would say that the custom coded approach is probably the least attractive, because if your programmer goes out of business or you can no longer get in touch with them and you start having issues, then you're basically jeopardizing your transactional flow. What you've had happen since the recession of 2009 is that you've had this evolution towards cloud-based applications, and in integration that has happened as well. And so we have a whole slew of solutions directed at different audiences that are called iPaaS. So they're integration platform as a service. The term iPaaS was coined by Gartner. And they had a very, very specific definition of what an iPaaS was when they first released the definition probably 10 years ago. And that was that it was a cloud-based platform where an IT shop could use the tools and the software to build their own integration. So it was really targeted at a DIY crowd. It was targeted at organizations that had their own IT shops and so on and so forth. That definition has morphed. And now what you see that reflect the reality of the marketplace is that you have companies like ours, which offer a managed iPaaS. So we actually build the integrations. We consult with the merchant on best practices, and we host as well as build and manage those services. So what that means is that you're outsourcing your integration to somebody who's an expert in the field, but you're also building on the availability of a commercial platform as opposed to custom coding things. And as a brand and as a merchant evolves, as they get higher up the food chain, a managed iPaaS becomes a very interesting service. And it's a strategic service, and it allows you to scale, handle volume, reduce errors, all of the things that anyone selling on Amazon has to deal with, timeliness of data. So, all of these things are basically addressed. Amazon has just gone through a whole new API change to their SP API, and that has precipitated a whole flurry of companies now having to try and get authorized with Amazon's new security requirements and so on and so forth. So this is where an iPaaS now comes into play, because we're already certified.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, you can move up the food chain, but there are pros and cons, and there are timelinesses about it. I'm going to throw a curve into this, is that at the lower end, there's also the plug and play solutions. And the plug and play solutions are designed for, if you look at some of the ERPs that are out there, they will connect you directly to Amazon, or they'll connect you to your Shopify store. Those kind of plug and play solutions are great, but they're built for the lowest common denominator. So if your business is slightly different, or you do things slightly different, they may or may not work for you. So that's part of your evaluation as to whether you go. We have a lot of customers that outgrow a plug and play because the plug and play can't handle the transaction volume.
Awesome. That helps. Thank you so much for simplifying that, because it definitely helps me. And, I sort of remember the days of how integration used to be and how it's evolved so much, which is crazy. And especially when it comes to e-commerce platforms, in particular Amazon, who has evolved over time. So in terms of a lot of that data, are there any key pieces of data that we're talking about? For example, orders, catalog data. What do you find is the kind of most, the data that's integrated the most?
So it depends again on the platform. Like if you look at Amazon, whether it's Vendor Central or Seller Central, you're looking at orders, fulfillments, shipments, inventory. You may have an order confirmation. And in the case of Vendor Central, you have a UCC 128 label. Amazon doesn't use it, but it's part of your requirements. It's a great way to get chargebacks. The cynical side of me is coming out here, but that's just something that's the reality of this kind of a world.
Yeah.
In e-commerce, generally, you get a lot more sophisticated. I mean, Amazon is fairly simplistic in its data feeds. When you get into e-commerce, you'll have order cancellations, refunds, price promos, and so on and so forth. Amazon is a lot less sophisticated from that perspective. And a lot of there's a lot of stuff that can be done faster on the Amazon portal than integration, because this speaks to the systems that companies use. A lot of systems are not designed to handle some of these data flows. So trying to get the data out of a system or into a system often can be a big challenge.
And I guess that challenge is more with a lot of the brands that have been probably go back to the traditional days of bricks and mortar, where they've already got their systems. They probably had an IT department coding everything or managing it all, as opposed to a number of these emerging businesses that are emerging as a result of success on Amazon, who are already built in that way, and probably plug and play works well for them. But I'm guessing it's these more established traditional not retailers or manufacturers, that are really the ones that require that level of integration.
No, I think that's correct in the way that you look at it. I would expand, though, the traditional or the legacy, as we call them, to be larger than just manufacturers and distributors, because it's anybody that's been in business for a while that has been trading and is looking for alternative channels. And sometimes the worst in that segment are the ones with custom coded ERPs, where there's an IT shop that they built everything in-house because they figured that their business was so unique and they were so special in what they did that they had to go out and have somebody build it, which is kind of ironic because, I mean, businesses all operate in the same way. We all operate with a profit and loss statement that's built on 19th century models. So you look at the current stuff, which is cloud-based, and much more of that is designed for this omni-channel world where the plug and play solutions work. The challenge, though, is that when you outgrow those solutions, where do you go? And this is where the higher level ERPs, you get into things like SAP and NetSuite and Microsoft Business Central or Finance and Operations. Now you're back to where the legacy guys are, is how do you integrate? What's the most efficient way to integrate? And do you have all the access to the endpoints? So you need to think about where you're selling and the channels you're selling in, because not every channel is going to be effective for every business.
Because I guess that's then, is it more effective to have, does it make sense to integrate all your data if you're dealing with one platform? Or is that down to, it depends how the scale in which you are as a size of a business?
It's a combination of things. Actually, some of the best research on the ROI has come out of Cranfield. They did some research with Tesco and GS1 probably 10, 12 years ago now on what was the tipping point for a business to justify the cost of integration. And their research, so they did this for Tesco, and that research has been replicated in North America also. And depending on the vertical, the numbers shift a small bit, but generally the tipping point is 20 to 25 orders a day. If you're getting 20 to 25 orders a day, you're at the point where you start to introduce errors into the manual data entry process. And they're subconscious errors, flipping in postal codes. So now your postal code is wrong. Address issues. And it's a subconscious thing. People don't even realize that they're making those errors. So that's the first metric. So 20 to 25 orders. The other metric is the basket size. So the size of the order. And depending on the vertical, what they've calculated is the order, invoice, shipment cycle is worth between $75 and $100 per order. So think about that. If your order size is less than $100 and you're doing everything manually, you're actually losing money on that order. And why are you losing money? Because you've got all the overhead, you've got inventory costs, you've got insurance, you've got payroll, you've got infrastructure costs that have to be factored into the whole thing. So I can't remember the name of the professor at Cranfield. I have spoken to him a couple of times, and it was quite interesting to hear his take on it, is that there's a reluctance from business to really address the issue of ROI because we've been so conditioned to doing things manually for so long that we don't really appreciate the costs that go in. And I think if you look at, since the pandemic started, you look at the costs, the price pressure on payroll, and you guys in the UK right now, with electricity costs and gas prices and so on and so forth. This all has to be factored now into the cost of handling that order. So sure, it may be a 50 quid order and you're doing it manually, but you may actually be losing money off of it.
That's crazy though, because 20 to 25 orders a day isn't much at all, really.
God,
so
really, It really is.
And the fact that, because when we speak to a lot of businesses, they are doing a lot of things still manually. And there's often this part where it comes down to control. But what you've just said is interesting because of the part of there's more room for error doing it manually. So there's this part of wanting to control it and almost this nervousness of trusting the system.
Yep.
But actually, there's more room for error by doing it, that having the human touch, than there is the, going with the actual integrated approach.
Yeah. And often we see companies who, when we're talking to them, they say, well, how do I know that the data is going in correctly? Well, that's part of the testing and the setup and the validation process. I think where some of the other fear comes from, and this is an interesting one, is that most companies' data sets, and Amazon is notorious for this, the data they warehouse is poor. And the former head of IBM years ago said that in the digital world, you trade on the validity of your data, and if your data is crap, then your trading is going to be impacted significantly. So one of the challenges we face in integration all the time is cleaning up data. Having the same UPC code for multiple products when it should be a parent-child kind of relationship, and where there should be a unique UPC code for the child, but it's all categorized under one umbrella, and then, oh well, we figure it out. Well, yeah, the human can make that decision, but the computer can't. You delve into the Amazon world with ASINs, and I mean, that's another whole conversation, and squatters and people ripping your UPC codes off, and
wow.
Yeah, that's a whole podcast for sure.
Oh my goodness. So from my days at Amazon, I've worked in multiple product categories, but I was part of launching clothing into the UK market. And that was one of the most challenging parts, and even footwear, where they've never really needed to have a unique code for every single size and every color.
That's right.
That has never been the way. So all of a sudden moving businesses over, it's not only a request from Amazon, it's a complete shift to how businesses operate in general.
Totally.
So yes.
Yeah, we had a shoe manufacturer who's still a customer of ours. Actually, I spoke to him just before this call. And when he went on to Amazon the first time and we tried to load up his UPC codes, everything came back, or 3/4 of the stuff came back as being invalid and in use. And we started looking into it, and it was offshore brands from Asia that were squatting on his UPC codes, and he couldn't therefore own the ASIN and then ultimately own the buy box. So he had to actually go through Own Your Brand and get all this data purged. It took probably 4 to 6 months to get everything cleansed properly. It was a massive job.
Wow.
And it really slowed down his ability to trade. And so, part of it was doing cleanup on the internal systems, but a lot of it was doing cleanup on the Amazon side. I mean, I think Amazon's notorious for bad data. So
completely when you explore the catalog. And I guess that there's two things then is we often find that when we start working with brands that aren't on Amazon, but they are on Amazon, so their products have already been listed by multiple sellers, and then they decide to sell on Amazon, you always have to prepare for a catalog cleanup, because you don't know what's going on in the back end, as you say. So I guess there's a stage there before, and is that before businesses can even integrate, is that they need to ensure A, their data is clean, and B, ensuring that the catalog is clean before they can even, because integration, I'm guessing, can't work unless that catalog, the items are set up and there aren't any squatters or anything on the listings.
Correct. So there's two things. One, you've got, to your point, you've got the the manufacturer, typically it's manufacturers where they go, they've got a whole distribution network and they find out, oh, well, let's, somebody in the C-suite figures, okay, let's get on Amazon, and sounds like a great idea.
Yeah.
Then they realize that a number of their distributors have already got their products listed on Amazon, and it's the distributor that owns the ASIN. So that's the first area that needs to be cleaned up. And sometimes that means taking the distributor down and justifying the ownership of the UPC code so that they own the ASIN and so on and so forth. And then once that's done with those kind of companies, then it's all of the extended data that's required for the Amazon profile to make you unique so that you show up in the buy box. How are you going to price? I mean, Amazon's got this global policy that you don't price lower anywhere in the world than on their platform. Then you've got images, the quality of the images. I mean, there's so many examples of lousy images on Amazon where the thing is skewed sideways and you can't really tell what it is.
Yeah.
So the whole idea of product and what you're going to sell on Amazon now becomes critically important. The other side of that is the reseller who figures, oh, Amazon's going to be a great channel. They're reselling somebody else's product. And then they realize that when they go to list, that they have to use the reseller's information or the ASIN owner's information. And now all of a sudden they don't control price. Even if they want to use a repricer, they don't control price. They don't own the ASIN. And I think that's another part of the evaluation is, do you venture down this and do you have enough control? And then what's the downstream effect then on that data when it comes to the integration of the orders and the fulfillments and so on and so forth? Product inventory and product inventory when you're a reseller becomes a big issue when you don't own the ASIN.
Yeah, I can imagine. So would you bundle all that data? Because we always sort of see orders almost and inventory very separate to catalog, but I'm guessing that all does that come then if you're dealing with a legacy brand, for example, manufacturer, coming from different sets? So we're not just talking about data from one system and moving it to another. Are we talking about lots of different systems from these manufacturers?
Yeah, well, and typically most of our customers don't automate product because they don't have a central point of truth for their product data.
Right. Okay.
So that's a challenge. So they'll use a product platform where they can, like a PIM, where they can put all that information and they can feed it. PIMs work great in a multi-channel, omni-channel environment, but if you're only selling to Amazon, I mean, it's easier to do it on the portal depending on the number of products you've got.
Yeah.
What we would integrate would be the orders, the inventory feed. Amazon requires a daily inventory feed and dedicated inventory, which is another challenge for a lot of companies that work on a first in, first out situation where, I mean, they can be selling through multiple channels, and if they oversell, they get penalized by Amazon. A lot of people don't realize it until they get
the chargebacks. Yeah,
they get the chargebacks, or they get delisted, and then everybody freaks out. And then we integrate fulfillments. Those are the typical ones that we do. All the reporting, most people don't integrate any of that stuff. I mean, they'll just go online and they'll run their reports themselves. So.
And you talk about Amazon and if we look at the vendor platform has mainly been around EDI, but with Amazon introducing more APIs, does that mean there's going to be a shift in terms of how businesses integrate? So you've got businesses that, let's say, have been functioning on EDI for years. Can they then shift to an API that's just going to be more dynamic?
Depends on their infrastructure. I mean, we've converted all of our clients on Seller Central to SP API. We get requests at least once a week from people who have been rejected by Amazon for SP API because they don't have a security layer.
Right. Okay.
So I think that that is only starting, because I think they have till August of next year to be fully compliant. And I think you're going to see a lot of the old school, the legacy stuff where, they built off the FBM APIs and they're fairly straightforward. You're going to see a lot of people scrambling because they just don't have the infrastructure, or they don't have the technical skill set to build the stuff. So that's one area. With Vendor Central, most of the vendors that are being targeted are doing EDI anyway, because they're selling to major high street retailers. So that's an area where I don't see a lot of change, frankly. People who are new, to your earlier comment about using cloud-based ERPs and so on and so forth, where there's plug and play, I could see those guys going API to Vendor Central. But anybody who's been doing Vendor Central for years with the EDI, they're not going to change it.
Yeah.
I mean, financially, it makes no sense to change it.
Yeah.
And you may not have the same functionality or the ability for speed that you have with the EDI, even though EDI traditionally is a batch process.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
really, it's going to be something that's key for businesses that are dealing with multiple channels, and that probably don't have a system already in place, like they're working with vendor, as you say, and just being able to, and as you said, the criteria of 20 to 25 orders a day, which is very little, is going to be more those businesses that just need a system to manage the multiple channels. I know we have a client that I speak to quite regularly, and I think they're dealing with about 10 different channels, but these 10 different channels work in different ways completely.
Totally.
That's a lot of work in terms of managing that, and then it goes into the one portal. I guess you'd think that Amazon would almost set a standard, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
No, I think for a merchant like the one that you just described, I would want to step back and look at those channels and how viable are those channels. And sure, there are channel aggregators out there that will allow you to come online and push your catalog out to, like, Zalando and eBay and Amazon and Walmart and so on and so forth. That's great. And then they provide the order management interface. The cost of those platforms is huge. And I mean, I'm not going to name any names, but there's a couple in North America that are ridiculously expensive. And I would question the strategy of the business, because do you need so many channels to sell your product? And would it be more cost effective to focus more energy on very specific channels where you've got good traction, rather than trying to sort of the machine gun approach and just shooting at everything that comes by? So I think that's another question that anybody doing omnichannel has to think about, because not every channel works for every product set. Yeah,
completely. And with that, you mentioned about the security. Is that a recent change with Amazon?
Yeah, it's in their new SP API.
Okay, so that means that lots of businesses that were integrated before can no longer. The doors have closed on them.
Well, they're closing. They haven't closed for sure completely, but they are closing. Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
And so, if they're using third parties, then they need to be registered developers. Yeah. And if you want to deal with PID on Amazon, you have to be a public developer. You can be a private developer as a one-off, but if you're going to a service that's a private developer, I mean, they're capped at the number of connections that they can make.
Right. Wow. Yeah. So really, I mean, can you actually grow and scale a business if you have no data integration solution?
I would say, and you're doing everything manually, I would say no. Not until not in today's world.
Mhm.
I was actually listening to a podcast last night from chief economist or former chief economist of the Canadian Export Development Corporation, and he was talking about the impact of technology in economic cycles,
Mhm.
and how technology is actually has accelerated growth. So traditionally we'd have cycles in the economy that were very predictable. Now what technologies do is pushing those cycles faster. We see the same thing in retail, where technology is pushing things faster than people can keep up. And if you're not willing to invest and you're not willing to automate, and you figure you can do it all manually, I mean, at some point, as we say here, you have to put a crowbar in your wallet. It's just because you won't grow. You just won't
Yeah.
grow.
Yeah.
People are too expensive. People
Yeah.
make mistakes. People have to be managed. Not everybody's aligned. You know, these are all computers do what they're told.
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't
That's
talk back. They don't have HR issues.
exactly. And I think that's a really valid point. Because we do see that resistance, and it's that resistance where there's a resistance to change, but also resistance to an investment. But there's that forgetting that part that you mentioned earlier, all the other costs involved of doing it manually, that sometimes businesses, it's not that they necessarily forget, but they don't include when they're doing that evaluation. And it's until you then say, you know, we even see it when we've spoken with some companies, and they tell us how they manage their orders for Vendor Central, for example, and how they do it so manually. And when you sort of challenge them on that, they're like, no, but it doesn't take me long. And it's like, it doesn't take you long, but if you add all of that up, and the cost of the company paying for you to do that versus having a system, etc., and does that make, you know, and it's that mindset shift of you know, and you mentioned the word earlier about fear. You used the word fear, and I think that's such an appropriate word, because there is this, I mean, I remember the days of the fear of even going on Amazon. You know, the role when I worked at Amazon was actually trying to sell Amazon to businesses to actually be interested to work with Amazon, you know, and it was that fear almost. And then it's not the fear of being on Amazon now, it's the fear of almost, then we're on Amazon, we're on all these channels, but then there's the fear of automation as well.
It's the fear of the unknown. They just they don't know. They don't have the knowledge, they don't have the experience. And I mean, we see it in our sales cycles constantly, where people who don't understand the value around what they're and how it works technically, they gravitate to what they do understand, and that's how much it costs. And if if there is no cost, if there is no relationship with value on the table, or it's not articulated, then the fallback is to do things manually. So there's a certain fear. I think there's a generational shift that is going on, and that generational shift is that the older, the boomers, and I'm a very late boomer. I mean, the fear of losing control because you don't feel comfortable with the technology is something that is very pervasive. And if you look at most small to medium-sized companies that are not new, if you look at the owner manager, 50s, maybe early 60s, didn't grow, is not a digital native. And so there's a little bit of fear of technology. I once, was in a meeting, this is years ago, big ice cream manufacturing company here in Canada, who are a customer of ours. And the owner looked at me across the table and she said, Robin, she said, this internet thing, this is a fad. And in those days, they had one email address for the whole company. And it took them forever because she was such a curmudgeon about the whole the whole internet thing. And now, I mean, they've embraced it and they do everything online and so on and so forth. And there's almost this kicking and screaming. And I think it's control. I think it's also, you don't understand, so you don't want to let go. You know, you don't trust the controls. Like, are people going to do it the same way? Are they going to do it right?
Yeah.
So it's easy to fall back on, yeah, I'm going to have somebody pound the keyboard and you know, without thinking of the costs. It provides a comfort level.
Yeah. That's funny though, about the one email and it being a fad for sure. I know I was watching
that was years ago.
Yeah.
But it was indicative of the mindset of technology.
Yeah, completely. That's I remember the days. I remember the days of at university being introduced to how to search for something in a search engine, and that was our training course. And that was the days where you had to put the brackets and the plus and
oh my
signs
God,
and everything to remember what you're searching for as well. So, and I think that's a great way to sort of wrap up. And this is really interesting because it really just sort of highlights that it is the future for businesses in this space. And if businesses want to grow, then they can't grow if they don't have that element of automation and integration as well, I guess. So yeah, that's really what it is. And I think it's just trying, as you say, it's a mindset thing. It's letting go and being able to, it's the future.
Oh, completely. And you look at companies in the UK that are of, you know, what I would call the next generation. You look at companies like Gymshark and that, and how automated they are. I mean, Ben's done a great job there.
Completely.
And some really interesting stuff, invested in technology on the back end. Now they went through, in the early days, they went through a lot of experimentation, going from Magento to Shopify, back to Magento, back to Shopify, finally putting in NetSuite. And you know, I mean, but there was a recognition that they couldn't scale if they didn't have the tech stack, the appropriate tech stack.
Yeah, definitely.
They didn't partner with experts.
Yeah.
As you well know, you get what you pay for.
You sure do.
You go on the cheap and you're hiring, you know, people that are, there was a post the other day in the Shopify jobs channel that somebody was posting for need expert Shopify developer for $10 an hour, $10 US an hour. And I thought, oh yeah, you're going to get a real expert for that price.
My goodness. Yeah. It's just, as you say, for anything, you get what you pay for. And that's usually what we say to a number of businesses as well that try to negotiate you down. But at the end of the day, you bring expertise to the table, and it helps those businesses grow and scale. And that's what you have to offer. So I always ask one last question to our guests is, and it's almost giving some of our listeners a tip, that if someone is sort of on that fence thinking about whether to integrate or not, what would be that tip?
I would step back and look at the business strategically in terms of the channels they're selling into. We often see customers sort of like a bull in the china shop, where they race into a channel because a competitor, they've seen a competitor on the channel, or somebody they talked to said, oh, it's so easy, you should be on Amazon. And you know, so that would be the first thing I would do. And then second of all, I would step back and look at your systems. Are your systems capable of handling the requirements of that channel? Because that's another element that we see often, is that people just don't have the tech stack to be able to satisfy the requirements of the channel. And they get into it, and all of a sudden now the chargebacks start piling in, they're delisted, it affects their brand, and you know, so on and so on. You know, the downstream impacts are huge. So those are the two things that I would look at. And then the third thing I would throw out is once you are embarking on onboarding a channel, I would look at the technical requirements. A lot of people don't look at that until they've actually signed a contract and they're now committed.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really, really interesting about how you say that, because there's a question we always get asked, which is, do I become a seller or a vendor? And there's so much content out there that used to talk about the advantages of, well, you can do this on seller or you can do this on vendor. And my response is always about, take it back. What's your infrastructure? Because it's not even worth considering a platform like vendor if you don't have that set up to even send in inventory and manage purchase orders. And we've seen it happen so many times where Amazon sell the vendor dream to a seller that is doing really well on Amazon. And they're like, come to vendor. And it's almost like the promised land of, we've made it to vendor. They go to vendor and then, as you say, get hit by chargebacks. They end up out of stock as a result. They can't manage the POs. They don't have the system. And then their sales just drop. And then they end up going back to seller because it's the fundamental infrastructure that some of these businesses don't have. So I think that's a brilliant tip in terms of taking that step back and looking at your business as a whole, and not diving straight into things.
Yeah, and I would even add that we see the same thing with FBA. Is that people dive into FBA and think, oh God, I'm going to get access to Amazon's warehouses, without realizing that you have to manage where the product is going to go.
Yep.
That Amazon's going to tell you where the product goes. You have to decide based on the information they provide. And do you have the technical capabilities to do that? And are you willing to then move that inventory around and so on and so forth? I mean, it's an 11-step process on the portal to do FBA allocations. So you're not going to integrate that because it's impossible. There's no system out there that can integrate that efficiently, despite what people say. So again, to your point about stepping back and really understanding what you're getting into, is it cheaper to go with a 3PL?
Yeah. So. Exactly. Awesome. Thank you so much for all your insights and on this subject. I know it's a complex subject, and it's definitely, the way you've explained everything has really helped me understand it a lot more clearly. So thank you so much for sharing your experience and insights with our listeners. And for those that are listening, if you want to know more about VL OMNI, as we mentioned earlier, VL OMNI is an integration platform for agile and scalable iPaaS data integration. They empower businesses to accelerate growth by integrating their systems and channels, partners, and applications together based on their needs. So if you visit vlomni.com, and you'll find the website in the link in the description of the podcast, to see why top global brands trust them to move data seamlessly through their infrastructure as they grow and accelerate their business. Also, if you need support on Amazon in the US and Europe, reach out to us at ecommercenurse.com. We would love to hear from you and see how we can help you on your Amazon journey. So thank you once again, Robin.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It was a great conversation, enjoyed it thoroughly. And next time I'm in the UK, maybe we can have a pint.
Definitely. Always up for a pint.